So we're very excited. I mean, New York has so much to offer. I think the guests and the attendees are going to be really thrilled with Broadway shows. Of course, the New York Knicks right in Madison Square Garden, a few steps away from easy walk to that. Museums, restaurants, anything from a bagel to pastrami to Chinatown to, I mean, every kind of ethnic food that you can possibly want. Jumping on the subway, the Staten Island ferry. I mean, it's New York. And I think, in terms of the conference, really trying to bridge some of the big ideas that have been coming out, integrating care. I know in New York we're really working now a lot on outcomes, which is really the buzzword in our treatment. And we're actually implementing some value-based kind of payment structures, so I think we'll probably be hearing something about that. And advancing new medications, of course, really how do we put them into our programs. And at the end of the day, I think, I'd love to think that in 18 months we'll have solved this, but the reality is, education and stigma is really the core of, unfortunately, still what we're doing in addiction and certainly in opiate treatment. So those are probably going to end up being, a lot of the buzzwords. I think the white papers that I know, ATOD just put out will probably guide a lot of what we're going to be looking at. Luckily we have 18 months to do a lot of the planning, but I think it's going to be a very exciting conference.
So Allegra, where can we go for more information on the 2018 ATOD conference?
So the ATOD website will have all the information about the conference, and that is www.atod.org.
Allegra, it was so exciting to have the conference, the ATOD conference here in Baltimore this year, but I'm really excited about having the 2018 conference in New York, and I'm really excited to be able to pass the baton as the conference chair to you, and I'm really excited to be coming to New York in 18 months. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about for the conference?
So we're excited to have it in New York also. So we're going to have the Marriott Marquis Hotel right in the middle of Times Square. So we actually have a Broadway theater right in the hotel. So we're very excited. I mean, New York has so much to offer. I think the guests and the attendees are going to be really thrilled with Broadway shows. Of course, the New York Knicks right in Madison Square Garden, a few steps away from easy walk to that. Museums, restaurants, anything from a bagel to pastrami to Chinatown to, I mean, every kind of ethnic food that you can possibly want. Jumping on the subway, the Staten Island ferry. I mean, it's New York. And I think, in terms of the conference, really trying to bridge some of the big ideas that have been coming out, integrating care. I know in New York we're really working now a lot on outcomes, which is really the buzzword in our treatment. And we're actually implementing some value-based kind of payment structures, so I think we'll probably be hearing something about that. And advancing new medications, of course, really how do we put them into our programs. And at the end of the day, I think, I'd love to think that in 18 months we'll have solved this, but the reality is, education and stigma is really the core of, unfortunately, still what we're doing in addiction and certainly in opiate treatment. So those are probably going to end up being, a lot of the buzzwords. I think the white papers that I know, ATOD just put out will probably guide a lot of what we're going to be looking at. Luckily we have 18 months to do a lot of the planning, but I think it's going to be a very exciting conference.
So Allegra, where can we go for more information on the 2018 ATOD conference?
So the ATOD website will have all the information about the conference, and that is www.atod.org.
Allegra, it was so exciting to have the conference, the ATOD conference here in Baltimore this year. But I'm really excited about having the 2018 conference in New York. And I'm really excited to be able to pass the baton as the conference chair to you. And I'm really excited to be coming to New York in 18 months. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about for the conference?
So we're excited to have it in New York also. So we're going to have the Marriott Marquis Hotel right in the middle of Times Square. So we actually have a Broadway theater right in the hotel. So we're very excited. I mean, New York has so much to offer. I think the guests and the attendees are going to be really thrilled with Broadway shows. Of course, the New York Knicks right in Madison Square Garden, a few steps away from easy walk to that. Museums, restaurants, anything from a bagel to pastrami to Chinatown to, I mean, every kind of ethnic food that you can possibly want. Jumping on the subway, the Staten Island ferry. I mean, it's New York. And I think, in terms of the conference, really trying to bridge some of the big ideas that have been coming out, integrating care. I know in New York we're really working now a lot on outcomes, which is really the buzzword in our treatment. And we're actually implementing some value-based kind of payment structures, so I think we'll probably be hearing something about that. And, advancing new medications, of course, really how do we put them into our programs. And, at the end of the day, I think, I'd love to think that in 18 months we'll have solved this, but the reality is, education and stigma is really the core of, unfortunately, still what we're doing in addiction and certainly in opiate treatment. So those are probably going to end up being, a lot of the buzzwords. I think the white papers that I know, ATOD just put out will probably guide a lot of what we're going to be looking at. Luckily we have 18 months to do a lot of the planning, but I think it's going to be a very exciting conference.
So Allegra, where can we go for more information on the 2018 ATOD conference?
So the ATOD website will have all the information about the conference, and that is www.atod.org.
Allegra, it was so exciting to have the conference, the ATOD conference here in Baltimore this year. But I'm really excited about having the 2018 conference in New York. And I'm really excited to be able to pass the baton as the conference chair to you. And I'm really excited to be coming to New York in 18 months. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about for the conference?
So we're excited to have it in New York also. So we're going to have the Marriott Marquis Hotel right in the middle of Times Square. So we actually have a Broadway theater right in the hotel. So we're very excited. I mean, New York has so much to offer. I think the guests and the attendees are going to be really thrilled with Broadway shows. Of course, the New York Knicks right in Madison Square Garden, a few steps away from easy walk to that. Museums, restaurants, anything from a bagel to pastrami to Chinatown to, I mean, every kind of ethnic food that you can possibly want. Jumping on the subway, the Staten Island ferry. I mean, it's New York. And I think, in terms of the conference, really trying to bridge some of the big ideas that have been coming out, integrating care. I know in New York we're really working now a lot on outcomes, which is really the buzzword in our treatment. And we're actually implementing some value-based kind of payment structures, so I think we'll probably be hearing something about that. And, advancing new medications, of course, really how do we put them into our programs. And, at the end of the day, I think, I'd love to think that in 18 months we'll have solved this, but the reality is, education and stigma is really the core of, unfortunately, still what we're doing in addiction and certainly in opiate treatment. So those are probably going to end up being, a lot of the buzzwords. I think the white papers that I know, ATOD just put out will probably guide a lot of what we're going to be looking at. Luckily we have 18 months to do a lot of the planning, but I think it's going to be a very exciting conference.
So Allegra, where can we go for more information on the 2018 ATOD conference?
So the ATOD website will have all the information about the conference, and that is www.atod.org.
Well, good morning. We realize that there are more people that want to get into this room, so we're going to see if we can expand access through that wall. They're going to take a look at that. But for those of you who are gathered, who are in this room, obviously if you need to, you can come down a bit. There are a couple of extra seats, not too many, but we are going to look to see if they can get the engineers to create that extra space. So let me just say that this is our closing session. We've covered a great deal of ground over the past several days since this conference began on Saturday. I realize that for some of you it seems like a month, but actually it's been a very good conference. I hope you feel that the information you've received is solid and certainly will help you with your work as you leave. Now this session provides a forward-thinking federal policy perspective from the Drug Enforcement Administration and from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. As you know, ATOD has worked very closely with both of these agencies since our inception. We're fortunate to have their leaders with us this morning, and they're going to give us their perspective on how our nation will move ahead to more effectively deal with the challenge of opioid use disorders. We will first hear from Chuck Rosenberg, the Acting Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, providing an understanding what the DEA is doing to respond to this public health challenge. We've worked closely with DEA officials since 1984, and we are grateful for their collaboration with the other federal agencies. And I have to say that I give a good deal of credit to Mr. Rosenberg for developing these new collaborative initiatives, which were clearly in evidence during the presentation given by Demetra Ashley at the Saturday evening open board meeting. I can tell you that without any question, over the next year, you are going to bear witness to significant changes which will open access points for the OTPs, notably an increase in new licensing of mobile van units so they can get to people outside of the region. You will be hearing encouragement as DEA collaborates further with SAMHSA, printing and developing updated guidelines for the field, which they anticipate will be released in 2017, again reflecting newfound changes so that the NTP guidelines from the DEA are working in conjunction with the SAMHSA guidelines, which were published in 2015. So this is an excellent collaboration to look forward to. We will then hear from Michael Botticelli, the Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, discussing what we're doing to confront this challenge with so many of their initiatives. And obviously you don't need to have me go through an elaborate introduction of the Director, since you heard from him last evening as we received our association's Friend of the Field Award. So, Chuck Rosenberg was appointed Acting Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration on March 13, 2015, by Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Prior to joining the DEA, Mr. Rosenberg served as the Chief of Staff and Senior Counselor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Director, James Comey. Before rejoining the FBI, Mr. Rosenberg was a partner at a Washington, D.C. law firm. And prior to that, Mr. Rosenberg served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, which is routinely entrusted with many of the nation's most sensitive terrorism and national security precautions. Mr. Rosenberg also served in several senior posts at the Department of Justice, where his work focused on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, national security, and criminal matters, including serving as the counselor to Attorney General John Ashcroft and the counsel to the FBI Director Robert Mueller. Mr. Rosenberg is a graduate of Tufts University, Howard University, and he received his law degree from the University of Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Rosenberg.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Hey, thank you very much for having me here. I like to wander around a bit when I talk, so if I start doing that, actually I'll start doing that now. Forgive me. One thing you can tell from the introduction, Mark, and it was very gracious of you, is that I can't keep a job. I've been in federal law enforcement in one way or another for about 25 years, but I'll tell you something that's a little bit different in this job. I started as a federal prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, where I did almost every federal criminal statute except for narcotics work. I did white-collar work, I did violent crime work, did crimes against children. Later in my career, I did espionage and terrorism, but sort of the one thing I didn't do was precisely what I'm doing now. So I have a ton to learn. And the only way to learn, I have found, people tell me this over and over, and they're right, you don't learn by talking, you learn by listening. And so in my 15 or 16 months on the job, although at times it feels one hell of a lot longer, I have been traveling around the country to meet with the men and women of the DEA. I was in my 81st office yesterday to hear from them, what do they see, what are they feeling, what are they thinking, and what is it we can do to make us better, right? More efficient, more effective, because like a lot of federal agencies, we are one of limited means and limited resources. Let me tell you a little bit about the DEA, and then I want to get on to some stuff that you might find, I think, more relevant. I guess that means I'm starting with stuff that you'll find irrelevant as I think about it. So DEA has about 9,000 men and women and 300 offices around the world. They do incredible stuff. There's a bit of a mythology about the DEA, part of which I like and embrace and part of which I don't like and reject. But we're not busting kids in dorm rooms for smoking dope. We're working the biggest and most difficult and most violent cases in the country. International drug cartels, violent street gangs. We don't have the resources, the time, or the inclination to work small stuff. We work big stuff. We have about 4,500 special agents, and we have another 2,500 task force officers. Those are state and local officers who are assigned to us and work full-time with us. That means that almost one-third, a little more than one-third of our law enforcement cadre are state and local officers, a very important part of who and what we are. One of the things I've learned in this role, and I don't think, I think there's a lot of hyperbole in our sort of policy and political discussions, and that lots of words are overused, like unique or unprecedented or historic. But I don't think the word epidemic is overused here. I think that's precisely what this is. And it's absolutely shocking to me. Again, remember, I was a prosecutor who did everything but narcotics work to find that 47,000 some odd people had died from a drug overdose in the last year. We measured it 2014. And by the way, you guys know this better than anyone. That's an undercount. It can't be an overcount. At best, it's accurate, but at worst, it's an undercount. And it's probably an undercount in two ways. The first way is that some people who have died of a drug overdose, it's just not reported in that way. And then the second way that I think of it as an undercount is that overdose doesn't necessarily mean fatal overdose, right? the 47,000 is the fatal overdose number, but what's the ratio of people who overdose compared to the number of people who die of an overdose? I don't know. I've heard different estimates, 10 to 1, 15 to 1, 20 to 1. There's a study out of Australia that suggests it's 30 to 1. If that's right, and if it's 30 to 1, that's 1.5 million overdoses. That's stunning. And so we got a ton of work to do. And I wanted you to know that the DEA is coming at it in sort of 3 different ways. The first way is our traditional law enforcement. I've already talked about the fact that we have limited resources. For all the work we have to do and all the places we have to cover, remember, just 4,500 special agents. That makes us about 1/3 the size of the FBI, which in turn, and this is a shocking number, is about 1/3 the size of the New York City Police Department. So federal resources are actually not quite as large as you might imagine. But traditionally, right, we are law enforcement. But we're also diversion. And you heard from, Mark mentioned Demetra Ashley, the fact that she spoke to your board the other day. We're also a regulatory agency. We regulate 1.6 million registrants, as you well know. Many of you among them, I suppose. And my view is that 99% of them are our allies in this, or want to be our allies, or maybe not our friends, but our allies. In other words, that these are good people doing good and important things, and that we ought to work more closely with you, not keep you at arm's length. There are bad apples in any group, because we're human beings, there are bad apples, right? You know that. Whether we're talking about dentists or pilots or law enforcement officers. But the overwhelming majority of us are folks who try to get it right. Because we're human, we stumble and fail. We make mistakes, but we try and get it right. And so I've asked my folks in diversion, and I hope you see some of this reflected in your meetings with Demetra, to reach out to you, to work with you, to take your suggestions, right? To take your criticism. I promise you, we will not always do what it is you want us to do. I guarantee you, you'll be frustrated with us at times. I promise you all those things. But I also promise you that we're going to engage and we're going to try. As I said to Mark earlier, it's hard to hate up close, right? It's not impossible, but it's hard to hate up close, and so we're going to try and get up close. In diversion, we do, I think, lots of good, important things, including criminal diversion work. We've added a bunch of new tactical diversion squads on the enforcement side. We're now up to about 80 around the country. We have some resources on our diversion control fee account, and we're looking at a couple of things which I think are interesting, like using that money to hire financial investigators, using that money to sponsor special assistant U.S. attorneys around the country to do our diversion work, which is hard and cumbersome. I trust you're also all familiar with our take-back program. It was off when I got to the DEA. We turned it back on. We just had our second one this year. All told this year, and this is a stunning number, we took in 1.6 million pounds of stuff, right? 1.6 million pounds. We did it in conjunction with 4,000 state and local partners at 5,000 sites around the United States. That's cool. Now, some people will say, and it's a criticism, but I don't think it's a fair one, that some of that stuff we take in aren't opioids, right? Because we take anything, it's anonymous. So people turn in, Bengay and toothpaste and old toasters and baseball gloves. That's fine, because by some estimates, 10% of what we take in are opioids. And even if it's, quote unquote, only 10%, that's 160,000 pounds of opioids. So it's 1.6 million pounds of stuff and maybe roughly 160,000 pounds of opioids. So we're going to continue to do that. But what I want to really focus on, I guess there's a clock here, which in theory tells me when I have to shut up. But unfortunately for you, I have 17 minutes and 10 seconds. I want to talk a little bit about another thing that we're really trying to emphasize at the DEA, which is demand reduction. And I'm going to fit you into that piece of it. I know that's not precisely what you do, but give me a little leeway here. Ever since I was a brand new baby prosecutor, remember, I wasn't doing this stuff. whatever stuff I was doing, I always felt we're not going to prosecute or enforce or jail our way out of this mess. I felt that way then, and I feel that way now. It's not going to happen. And again, because we have limited federal resources on the enforcement side, right? Like I said, we're not busting kids in their dorm rooms for smoking dope. We're going after sort of that unholy alliance between violent drug cartels and violent street gangs. That's where we aim our work. So if we're not going to enforce or jail or prosecute our way out of this mess, well, how are we going to get out of it? Assuming we're going to get out of it. I think we can. We can change behaviors in this country. Michael and I have talked about this before. Whether it's seat belts or smoking, we can change behaviors, but it's really, really hard. We have to change behavior here, and so we've been thinking a lot at DEA about demand reduction. I'll tell you a couple of things that we're doing. One thing we're doing, right, we're trying to encourage all of our men and women, often on their own time, so as volunteers, right? They don't get paid to speak in middle schools or high schools. They don't get paid to, coach Little League either. Wish they did. I did that for years. But we're having them go to schools and talk to kids relentlessly about how dangerous this stuff is. We put out a movie recently with the FBI called Chasing the Dragon. Have any of you seen that? Yeah, a few of you? Good. I encourage you to watch it and maybe use it in your own work, or even just to watch it with your children or your nieces or your nephews. Available at DEA.gov or FBI.gov. You can also grab it off of YouTube. But Chasing the Dragon is something we ought to talk about often and publicly because we have to drive this message home. I'm an old white guy. No one's going to listen to me. Nobody's going to listen to me. But in that movie, we use kids to talk to kids. And that's one way we're going to perhaps bridge this gulf. We just did something really interesting with Discovery Education. Discovery Communications has a group called Discovery Education. And together with them, we're doing something that we've called Operation Prevention. It is a STEM-based curriculum that you can drop into any middle or high school in the country, and it will teach you the science behind opioid addiction, how opioids bind with certain receptors in the brain, and the physiological consequences of that. We had our first virtual field trip 2 weeks ago at a high school in Northern Virginia. I'm told 200,000 people watched it, which is pretty cool. Right, so one step at a time, we're trying to do more and more here. Then I said I was going to make you a part of my remarks with respect to demand reduction. Let me explain. I see treatment, rehabilitation, all of those things that you think we ignore and don't think about as an integral part of our work together. Now, I know it may sound strange for the guy who runs DEA to be talking about working together, but we need you, I think, every much as you need us. We just do different things, but we're on the same field, right? We're playing different positions on the same field. And so while we will primarily focus our work on our enforcement and our regulatory side, we have to do demand reduction, and we have to engage with you. Mark touched on some of the things that Demetra said the other day, things where I think you think we can do better. We're going to try. I so much appreciate the work that you do. It is, you're not in it for the money, right? If you are, I have bad news for you. or a subpoena. But you're in it because you care and you want to make a difference. And it's exactly the same reason why we're in our line of work. We're not that different. We care and we want to make a difference. Like I said, we're going to have our disagreements. We're going to stumble over things. We'll do things you don't like. I promise you that. But we're going to try and get this right and draw on your expertise and your knowledge and your passion and your commitment. Because if we don't reduce demand, right, we don't treat people who are addicted, we don't help them through rehabilitation, this ugliness is just going to continue. It has to stop. I still have 11 minutes and 50 seconds. What I'm going to do, and this is to your great benefit, as I know I sound like some member of Congress, is yield the balance of my time to Mr. Botticelli. He is not just a good friend, he is a remarkable public servant. And I've felt privileged in this job to get to know him. So I wanted to thank you for letting me speak here today. Bear with us. We're not perfect, but we're trying. We have really hard jobs at the DEA. My men and women put themselves in harm's way every single day. And I always dread that call. And it's happened too many times in my brief tenure when somebody's gotten hurt or worse, killed, trying to do what they do, which is enforce the laws of the United States and stop this ugliness and this violence from spreading. We need you to do what you do, we need you to help us reduce demand, and when appropriate, we need you to criticize us. Tell us what we can do better, and work with us. Thank you for what you do. I mean it with all my heart.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chuck. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. His schedule is very tight, and I can tell you, I have the advantage of longevity. So when I started working with DEA officials on behalf of our field was in 1984. Now that's a long time ago, and if you're anything like one of my administrative assistants, she would say when I reference things like that, well, by the way, this was done in 1984, and she'll just cheerfully look at me and say, you know, I wasn't born then, Mark. I don't know. I never find those references particularly helpful. I have no idea why people will do, but I don't. Or my new favorite, which has apparently come up as I've gotten a bit older, is, oh my God, you're older than my parents. And of course, my response to that is, oh my God, too. So, you know, I recognize that we all move on, but what Chuck is saying is true. And the longevity is when you meet with federal agencies, which is obviously a major part of my work, and connecting the tissue between one agency and the other, which sometimes can be slightly surreal. And there are days when my staff know that when I start making animal sounds, which is never a great side, is because it's gone so far over the edge that you spend time trying to retrace and reconnect the fabric of the federal agencies. From my point of view, when one of our board members said, why do you spend so much time trying to connect ONDCP, DEA, SAMHSA, FDA, CDC, the various sub-agencies, is because if they are connected in their work, we, our field, is better prepared and we are more stable. I'm going to give you a specific reference point before I go on to introduce Michael again. The reference point was in the year 2000, when the DEA first produced their NTP guidelines. By statute, they refer to our programs as narcotic treatment programs. That's a congressional statute. That's not them trying to be contentious or going back to an old way of thinking. But when those guidelines are published, which was done at our conference in San Francisco 16 years ago, about a year to 2 years subsequent to the publication of the guidelines, our deal, so-called with the DEA, would be once the OTPs got them, all the DEA field agents, the special agents in charge throughout the United States or where there was any jurisdiction from the DEA in dealing with our registrants. And everyone would get the material at the same time. They did. And there was subsequent training of the DEA agents. After that, all of the lack of compliance issues came down across the board. Fines started coming down. And DEA field agents were seen as more collaborators than enforcement authorities, not forgetting that enforcement was their first issue. So we anticipate this is going to happen again as these new NTP guidelines are published in 2017. and they have already gone over to SAMHSA 2 weeks ago in preparation for this conference, and they are now going to be more collaborative in nature. And that's the importance of the interagency policy collaboration. That's how it affects you right on the ground each and every day. Because as I've said to Chuck and Demetra in the past, and there may be the program administrator from Evergreen, but last summer, not this past, last summer, to give you an idea of what happens on the contrary side, which is a DEA field agent went into a program in Seattle and issued a verbal cease and desist order to the program administrator, basically saying you can no longer deliver medication to that jail. Now, this affected medication delivery for 200 opioid inmates at that time. And a cease and desist order immediately would have endangered them, especially women who happened to be carrying. They were pregnant. So ultimately and this happens a great deal in our offices in New York, so the administrator calls me and says, I've got this DEA agent outside of the next room. He just issued a verbal cease and desist order. What do you recommend I do? And I'm very aware of the fact in the comfort of my office in New York, I can be of little real help because I can't go out there. And so I proposed something that he felt was slightly risky. And the proposition was, here's what you should do. Explain to the DEA official that you cannot act on a verbal cease and desist order, given that your primary concern is to protect the well-being and the life of those particular people because you are responsible for caring for them. Therefore, respectfully and with great diplomacy, you go back and you say, we can't act on your order right now. However, we would like to have a letter on DEA letterhead with a specific citation to the statutory issue which gives legal force to what you are asking. So the administrator and his lawyer are on the line and they say, okay, Mark, that's really good advice, but you know, he's still out there. And you are still in New York. And so how do you know this is going to work? I said, because I've been doing this for a very long time. So you have to trust this. And I know you're having a hard time right now trusting this because he has done something to you which has made you quite fearful. So I recognize whatever I have to say doesn't quite match the fear that he has induced in you. But understand, I would not guide you wrong because the next call I do not want to get from your assistant administrator is, good call, Mark, now he's in jail. So they did that, they made the call, and what do you think happened? The DA Washington Bureau said, you know what, we don't think we're going to get that letter to you because we don't want to necessarily get this on record. So you keep doing what you're doing. So now with that, let me bring up Michael Botticelli. You know, those of you who were at the banquet last evening, that he is the director of ONDCP and has been there since he was sworn in February of 2015. I was at that swearing-in ceremony in DC. For me, it was a dream come true to have somebody like this in that position. And there's a reason, because this guy has 2 decades of experience in dealing with this work. He's worked with Americans in how to deal with disabilities and their addiction. He served as the director of the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services in the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. He worked with all of the actors in that state, especially the treatment providers. And he served in leadership roles for NASADAD, where he was a member. He co-authored many peer-reviewed papers. He does have a Bachelor's of Arts from Siena and a Master of Education from St. Lawrence. He's in long-term recovery for substance use disorders. But beyond that, as you saw last night, it's the heart of the human being. It's the ability of someone to understand the rigors of what we do, to understand what it is like to be at the dark edge of the abyss and then come away from it and understand that there is life through recovery and through a better understanding, a more connected human understanding of what it is our patients struggle with each and every day, and to understand what we do as treatment providers. And this is an incredible thing to have in someone at this level of governance. And remember, I've worked with every ONDCP director since 1984, even before there was the ONDCP. And to show you contrast, the first one I met with was Dr. Carlton Turner. And Dr. Turner was the ONDCP director for President Reagan. And Dr. Turner had gone to a House subcommittee to basically say, you know, these methadone patients, the ones that kind of stay for a couple of years, I guess they're essentially unmotivated, maybe a little bit lazy in what they do. And this will please the members of Maryland who are in the audience, so I went to meet with Dr. Turner with 4 board members from then the newly formed Northeast Regional Methadone Coalition. One of them was Richard Lane, then the director of Man Alive and our board delegate for Maryland. And after a half hour of meeting with Dr. Turner, because he repeated this with our colleagues, and for those of you who knew Richard, Richard was getting edgier by the moment. And I saw him close to the edge of his chair, so I knew that he was about to burst. And I looked and said, Richard, is there something you might want to say? Which was inevitable. And he says, I would, Mark. And then he squarely looked at Dr. Turner and said, I have been on methadone for over 25 years. I am the director of Man Alive. I am on the governor's council. And I am not unmotivated. I get up at 6 in the morning. I do all these things. I finally go to sleep at 12. And ultimately, I've achieved a great deal. And I simply do not want to have a day when I even have to wonder what I would be like without methadone. It's a boring medication, doesn't do anything for me. It's like anybody taking a medication for whatever they got. So, Dr. Turner, please keep this in mind. And of course, Dr. Turner, who was himself at that time a little edgy, then looked at me and says, Mark, this was very enlightening, and thank you. Thank you so much. And then, of course, we had a female board member, Kate Romano from Pennsylvania, because of the president's, Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, and this is my last story, so you will come up, which is when Kate said, because I figured, this may sound sexist to you, but I figured this would be much better coming from our female board member than from me, because she was elegant and delightful, and she says, you know, Dr. Turner, it would be great if we could get the First Lady to visit a methadone treatment program, either in the district or in Baltimore, because she's so interested in this. What do you think, Dr. Turner? And to my surprise, Dr. Turner did one great impression of the First Lady. And then he looked at me and said, so what you want, Mark, is for me to go to President Reagan and to say that I should have his precious Nancy go visit a treatment program. I said, yes, that would be it. He says, but Mark, they are felons there, and she might be a little bit nervous. He says, don't worry, we'll take care of her. And he just looked at me and said, well, you know what? Do you think you could get the patients to wear some blue sports jackets when they meet with her? Now, to show you that I have moments where I have no sense of shame, I said, if you get the First Lady to a program, I will buy those patients sports jackets. With that, please join me in welcoming Michael Botticelli.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Mark, for that introduction and for the stories. You know, just as an aside, one of the things that I think it's important for us to capture is, we as a field haven't been around that long, but we certainly have enough history that I think we need to be documenting our history and not, I know we have a grand tradition in the United States in terms of storytelling, but I do think it's really worth kind of capturing the work because I think it shows a couple things from my perspective. One, how far we've come, and second of all, how far we still need to go. Because unfortunately, the conversations that Mark's describing are all too often still happen today. And how we think about capturing hearts and minds in this issue are important. I know he had to leave, but I want to thank Chuck Rosenberg for his partnership and his work. Mark talked about the importance of kind of connective tissue among federal government. And quite honestly, by statute and by design, that's what ONDCP is supposed to be doing, right? So we have about 16 federal agencies that in some way or shape or form contribute to our national drug control strategy and are important for this effort. And our job is to make sure that we are aligning all of those 16 federal agencies according to the work that we're doing and ensuring that our federal agencies are supporting what we know to be effective evidence-based strategies. And you know, one of the things that I think Chuck exemplifies is an understanding and a fundamental premise that that has guided the Obama administration, and that we need a balanced strategy. So, you know, if you look at the history of ONDCP, you know, both from a leadership perspective, it was led by generals and law enforcement officers. And not only am I the first person in recovery, but I'm also the first person who comes from a treatment and public health background. And I think that that's indicative of where we are in terms of our drug policy in the United States. You know, I don't have to tell anyone here kind of why we need law enforcement. And I think all you have to do is to look at the availability and cheapness and purity of heroin in many of our streets, the fentanyl issue, which has just taken our breath away in terms of the opiate overdoses that we're seeing here, of why we need law enforcement. And quite honestly, one of the things that I think we've seen, and I hope you experience this as providers at the community level, is the profound willingness of our local law enforcement to understand the fundamental role that our public health and our treatment programs play in being part of the equation. And I think Chuck's work and focus on understanding both the law enforcement aspect of DEA, but also understanding that they're only one half of the equation here. And that unless we really spend time and emphasis on making sure we have good prevention, good treatment, good recovery support services, that we're not going to make progress. And if you look at the history of national funding as it relates to how we have attacked the drug issue, that for a very long time, the vast majority of funding that we have had has quite honestly gone toward law enforcement efforts, interdiction efforts. And our demand reduction, our prevention, treatment, and recovery support services have gotten short shrift. You know, I have to say, if you know, there are a lot of things. I screwed up a lot of things in this job, but one of the things that I feel really proud of is that as we leave this administration, for the first time in the history of our office, we'll be spending in the United States as much on public health strategies as we do on law enforcement efforts, and that's, I think, a testament to the work that you do. So, you know, let me just say one more thing. I said this last night. There are a lot of people like Mark and myself and many of you who have been doing this work for a very, very long time. And it can be trying work. Certainly no one's doing it to get rich. We are constantly making our case for why we exist, why we're important, and why we need this work. And, you know, and what sustains me, and I hope you felt sustained, as I was listening to the award recipients last night, they were being incredibly humble and not talking about their achievements, but really speaking from the heart and really speaking with passion and a sense of love and a sense of caring. And I know that that's the kind of treatment that you give your clients on a daily basis, because that's fundamental, I think, to our approach here of not, you know, clinical care and good medications are important, but it's fundamentally engaging people with a sense of dignity and respect that turned my life around, and I know turns your client's life around. And it's probably the first time in many of their lives that they experience love and support and caring in a non-judgmental attitude that really is transformative here. So, you know, we know, and I don't have to tell anybody through the magnitude, not only of just the overdoses, but the huge increase in addiction and heartache and misery that we have. And all of you know here, and I'm sure all of us have been personally impacted by this issue. There was recently a recent Pew Health survey that showed that 44% of Americans know someone who is personally addicted to an opioid, and actually considered the opioid epidemic one of the top health priorities of this country. And I hope you've gotten from our president and from every other federal official that this is an important priority in terms of the work that we've been doing here. And not only talking about it, but how we've made sure that we are trying to address all of the significant issues that we face here. So first and foremost, part of what we have had to do is to really fundamentally make sure that we are changing our approach here. So how we think about dealing with this as a disease instead of a moral failing is critical to our work here. Many of you know Johns Hopkins right down the street here does some tremendous work on this issue. But they did a survey on how people view people with substance use disorders and how that affects whether or not people are deserving of care. And what they found was really startling, that still too many Americans feel a sense of judgment against people with a substance use disorder and blame them, and how that translates into things like whether or not people deserve treatment. So we know that fundamentally how we view people with addiction has a direct impact on our public policy and the kinds of things that you're trying to do on a daily basis. But for too long, we've viewed people with substance use disorders negatively. And I think you all know how we still hear that rhetoric from some of our public officials and some of people in our country. And, I don't encourage this, but you might do the same thing that I do. So, whenever I see a kind of public article about things like naloxone or medication-assisted treatment, I look at the comments that people have submitted to the articles. And it's not a representative sample, but I encourage you to do that, because what it shows me is still how much work we have to do. So when I hear things about why should we revive people with naloxone, they're just due to themselves. They're wasting taxpayer money. It shows us how we need to continue to make sure that we are united in this effort. And I also agree with Chuck, and he uses a phrase that I have often used, that it's hard to hate up close. And I think it's why it's really important for those of us in recovery, for those of us who've been impacted by this issue, to be open and public as we can about this issue, because we profoundly change people's attitudes when we are open and honest about who we are. And we were talking about this morning, and I won't share the details of it, but it's really remarkable, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, that you have that moment about kind of disclosing not only about who you are, but what you do. Right? So people say what you do, and you have that moment of hesitation saying, oh, shoot, is this person going to understand what I do? Are they going to judge me? But I'm sure that many of you have the same experience that I do when you tell people. Their first response is, me too, my family too. And it's still too much of a secret in this country. And so, we need to be out and proud about who we are and what we do, because it's really important to change public policy. And I know that you have had a profound influence on this. As I've traveled the country over the past 4 years, I have seen a remarkable turnaround in our law enforcement officials around this issue, and I hope that you're experiencing. So when I hear echoed back from local law enforcement that we can't arrest and incarcerate our way out of the problem, I think it's really a remarkable turnaround. We have law enforcement officers all across the country who are carrying naloxone and reviving people. And many of you, I think, are familiar with the initiatives of many police departments who are talking about actually assisting people and getting them into treatment, right? So we have this new initiative, it's called the Police Assisted Addiction Recovery Initiative, where law enforcement and chiefs of police are saying, come into the police station and we'll get you treatment and we'll actually case manage. I will also kind of share another story. So I've done town hall meetings all across the country, and we usually have someone in recovery. We usually have a treatment provider, someone from the medical community, and usually a local law enforcement person there talking about their perspective. And I usually end the panels by asking each of them to say, what one thing do you need from the federal government as it relates to this work? And I cannot tell you how many times that the law enforcement, the chief of police, didn't ask for more task force officers. They didn't ask for more police officers. They asked for more treatment capacity, right? So here we have folks who are understanding that arrest will not solve the problem. And they are asking us for more treatment resources. So to that extent, our administration has tried to do everything that we can to ensure that every American has access to treatment. And I think some of our colleagues from SAMHSA are here before. So just released new information from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And while we're seeing some positive improvements in some of the work that we're doing, still one of the most disturbing facts was that only 1 in 14 people who meet diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder are getting the treatment that they need. Think about that, 1 in 14. I know. So, substance use disorders have roughly the prevalence of diabetes in our country, and I think the treatment rate for diabetes is about 80 to 85%, right? And so we're less than 10%. And I think you all know the repercussions of that. That, unfortunately, because of that lack of treatment, because of a lack of early intervention, we know that overdose deaths are skyrocketing. And part of this is, we're waiting for people, to conduct criminal behavior as a result of their addiction. And unfortunately, the entire burden of our issues, quite honestly, have fallen to law enforcement to do. And our medical community needs to step up to the table in doing a better job at early intervention, better job at early diagnosis, better job of referring people to treatment, a better job of integrating treatment in their primary care practices and in the work that they do. Because the entire burden of this issue has fallen to all of us here, and quite honestly, for law enforcement in the country. I think it's a shame that, Cook County Jail is probably our largest mental health and substance use facility that we have in the country. And I think that's a real shame in terms of the work that we're doing here. But we're changing that. So, we have done many things. One, I think that we have made sure that the president has talked about this issue. He's traveled the country. He's listened to stories. And the biggest thing he asked us, in his final year, he wanted to make sure that we were doing something big on this issue that was commensurate with the depths of the epidemic and that would have a difference. So I think he has proposed $1.1 billion in additional funding. That's in addition to things like ensuring that the Affordable Care Act has a defined benefit for substance use disorder treatment and making sure that our parity laws are fully implemented. But despite the fact that this epidemic is ravaging every part of the country, Congress has failed to act, right? So I sound like a bad public health person, but how many people do we have die of Ebola in the United States? And I'm not saying it's not an issue that we ignore. I think we have 1, right? Congress found a way to appropriate $1.5 billion for our Ebola response. Zika, again, issues that we have to deal with. But let's make sure that we're dealing equally with an epidemic that is ravaging the entire country. So let me tell you what Congress has done on this, right? So Congress, much to their own, patting themselves on the back, passed the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, right? So I'm not saying it's a bad law, but what do you think Congress appropriated for that law? $0. $0. And twice during the negotiations did people in Congress propose to support the president's budget, and twice it got voted down. And I don't want to sound partisan in this issue, but it generally fell along party lines, right? So Congress had the chance, and I got to tell you, there's many members of Congress out there who are now in their districts talking about the great work that they did in passing CARA with $0, right? So then, I'm going off script here. I hope you can tell. I only have 2 months to go, so what are they going to do? So what Congress said with CARA was, we can wait until the normal appropriation process. Mark, when's the last time Congress passed a budget? and had a normal appropriation process. Certainly not this year. So Congress has passed what's called a continuing resolution that keeps the government going until they can pass a budget, right? So they passed a continuing resolution, and even the $181 million in new grants that, that this law was supposed to fund, they didn't even act on that. And they only passed $7 million, $7 million, to an epidemic that's killing, over 140 people every single day. They passed $7 million. And so I got to tell you this story. So there was just after CARA got passed, we got a letter from a congressman in Florida who basically demanded of ONDCP that we release all the new funds that were appropriated to CARA so that his district could get additional dollars, right? So we sent a letter back, and we happened to give it to the local paper to say, well, Congressman, you passed a law that had no appropriation to it. So here's where you come in. Now, as a public official, as a federal official, I can't tell you what to do or what to say or who to call. But I can tell you that your voice matters. And that Congress needs to hear what you, your programs, your patients' parents are experiencing on a daily basis. 1 in 14 people can't get treatment. You have waiting lists for people. You still have people who don't have appropriate insurance coverage. You have states for whom Medicaid does not cover medication-assisted treatment or methadone treatment, or have arbitrary limits in terms of when people get cut off. Your voice matters. And part of what we need to do is make sure that it's being heard, and it's being heard by people who carry the purse strings in the United States. So, we, I think, have done a lot. We have a lot of work to go, but quite honestly, one of the biggest unfinished pieces of business that this administration has to do, and we will work tirelessly to ensure that this issue gets the attention of people in Congress and that they know that this is a top presidential priority in terms of getting additional resources to you to make sure that people have adequate access to treatment. So, but we also know that there are other factors that we need to make sure that we are focusing on. And one is that we also know that we have significant parts of the country where people do not have geographic access to treatment. I call them treatment deserts. So, and we know, Mark and I were talking before, about how we ensure that people have adequate access to treatment in the communities where they are. So they're not having to drive 100 miles every day to access methadone treatment, to find a physician who will who does buprenorphine, of making sure that there are not bricks and mortar treatment programs. So we will continue to do what we can and continue to take actions to ensure that people have appropriate access to care. I think and I hope you know this and I hope you feel this, that one of our top priorities is not only just increasing access to treatment, but making sure that every patient has access to medication-assisted treatment. You know as well as I do that it's the gold standard of treatment for people with opioid use disorders, and that we have too few physicians who are willing to do it. We have too few opioid treatment programs in parts of the country where we need them. We want to make sure that we're continuing, that we have too few community health centers who have integrated medication-assisted treatment in our treatment programs. We have too many prisons and drug courts who have failed to adopt and accept medication-assisted treatment as part of the work that they're doing. So we will continue to do everything that we can to make sure that we are dealing with those issues and that we are using our federal grants in appropriate ways. But one of the other issues that we have heard and we've known is that even though parity was passed in 2008 and that the Affordable Care Act requires plans under Affordable Care Act and benchmark plans to make sure that those substance use disorder benefits are offered at parity, that we still have a long way to go to really fully realize and implement and enforce the parity laws. So in March, when the president went to West Virginia, I will paraphrase something that Mark said to me. It was, I think, one of the first times that the President of the United States actually said the word methadone in terms of the work that he was doing. So, obviously ensuring access to medications is a top priority for the work that we're doing. But one of the things that we knew we had to spend some more time on is making sure that we at the federal level, we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're fully implementing and fully enforcing parity laws in the United States. So back in March, when the president went to West Virginia, he also issued an executive order to set up a federal mental health and substance use parity task force that we released our report last week in terms of the work that we're doing. And we also announced a series of actions that we were taking. It not only recommended strategies, but also implemented some work that we're doing to make sure that we're fully implementing the law. So the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services announced that they were giving out grants to state Medicaid agencies and state insurance commissioners to make sure that they are fully enforcing and implementing parity. CMS will now conduct reviews of benchmark plans to make sure that those plans are meeting parity. We are working, and our colleagues at SAMHSA will be hosting 2 policy academies, one for Medicaid and one for commercial insurance, to make sure that states are implementing this. One of the other issues that we've heard, and I would encourage you to take a look at it, is we heard from patients and we heard from parents that navigating and finding out where to send a complaint, finding technical assistance was a real issue. So HHS has launched a single site parity portal to allow people to find out and to talk to a manager at the Department of Labor to understand where to direct complaints and how to make sure that they are getting the information that they need to file those complaints. So we'll continue to make sure that we are focusing on those issues. The Department of Labor has also agreed to make sure that they will issue an annual report in terms of parity violations and parity investigations that they've closed so that other folks can look at those issues. They also issued what they're calling warning signs 2.0. And I know many of you experience this, where clients often have to fail first at other levels of care before they're offered medications. So the Department of Labor and HHS just released what they're calling Warning Signs 2.0, and it clearly talks about signs of parity violations for those kinds of fail first policies. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that information. SAMHSA also published a pamphlet called a Know Your Rights around disclosure. I would make sure you get that out to every single client who comes into your program to make sure that they understand kind of what their rights are as it relates to the work that we're doing. So let me just talk about a couple other things, and then we have some time for some questions. Obviously, we have been working diligently on the opioid epidemic, and I remember being in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts, like many parts of the Northeast, always had historically high heroin rates. And we were, I think the Northeast, Baltimore on up were kind of really impacted significantly by the opioid epidemic before the rest of the country was. And I remember coming to federal meetings just saying, what are we doing on this issue that we're losing too many people? And so even before I got to ONDCP, they released a strategy talking about dealing with the opioid epidemic. And I think it had a number of pillars that we've made some good progress on. So the first and foremost was education, of making sure that prescribers in the United States had some minimal amount of education as it related to safe and effective opioid prescribing. I think you all know this, that I think it's from 2013, physicians in the United States prescribed close to 260 million prescriptions for opioids in the United States to give every adult American their own bottle of pain pills. And it's an important priority to make sure that people are appropriately treated for pain, but we know we have vast overprescribing of prescription medications in the United States. And part of this stems from the fact that our medical community gets little to no training on addiction and little to no training on safe and effective opioid prescribing. So we worked in concert with states. We have many states now that have passed some mandatory prescriber education laws. CDC just released their opioid prescribing guidelines for chronic pain. So want to make sure that we are implementing that. And I'm happy to say that many states are actually looking at those guidelines and making sure that people are doing those. And quite honestly, for the first time in decades, we are beginning to see a decrease in the volume of opioid prescribing in the United States. So we're starting to see that change. But we also know that kind of monitoring people and looking at their prescribing histories become particularly important. And I think you've seen not only people who are going multiple physicians and pharmacies, but also people who are getting really lethal combinations of medications, particularly opioids and benzodiazepines. And so, setting up prescription drug monitoring programs was an important priority for the administration. When we started, only 30 states had PDMPs. And so now we have 49 states and the District of Columbia who have a PDMP program. Who's here from Missouri? I know, I was going to task them with some action. So as you might guess, Missouri is the only state that hasn't passed prescription. But we're making sure that these programs can talk to each other across state lines. We want to make sure we're linking these prescription drug monitoring programs to electronic health records. I want to thank ATOD and the work that you do in understanding the importance of our OTPs checking. But we also want to make sure that we're guaranteeing people privacy. So we've never supported having OTPs have mandatory, have to enter data into the prescription drug monitoring program. So I appreciate the work that you're doing here. So Chuck already talked about drug take-back days, but if there's any indication why we need take-back, there was a recent article in JAMA that just came out a couple days ago, and I think many of you have seen it, looking at pediatric ingestion and poisonings associated with opioids. So in the 1 to 4-year-old range, I think it's doubled in terms of the number of kids. And regardless of whether it's opioids or not, we need to get people in the practice of, one, safely storing their medication, and two, getting in the habit of not leaving unused medications in the house. I think it's just good, pharmaceutical hygiene, but clearly getting opioids out, because we know that 70% of people often start by using prescription pain medication. So let me just end by one other area that I think is important. One is, and I know that you've all done this, really the importance, and I think this is really heightened by the fentanyl that we see in many of our communities across, of making sure that people who are at high risk are getting a prescription for naloxone. I think many of you are now working in programs that are distributing it. You're working in states that allow for some level of access to naloxone without a prescription, either through the pharmacy or through other means. So it's really, really important in this environment that particularly people with opioid use disorders have ready access to naloxone. It's really crucial for the work that we're doing. And also, I think it's really critical in this epidemic that we continue to expand people's access to sterile syringes in the work that we're doing. We need to do a better job of outreach and engagement for people who are still actively using. The rates, and I'm sure, you have the vast majority of your clients who are in your programs have Hep C. And we've seen outbreaks in places like Scott County, Indiana, of big increases in HIV for people who are doing that. I'm happy to say one of the other things that I feel very proud of, and we did this in concert with many folks, that after a decades-old ban, the federal government actually rescinded the ban on federal funding to support syringe service programs. So it's wild. So the last thing I'll say, and is all of these things are great. We need to do all of them. But we do need to fundamentally change the way that we think about people with substance use disorders. And one of the ways that we convey what we think about people with substance use disorders is the language that we use. So a good friend of mine, there's some, Ingrid Olsen is here, who's written about this issue. Good friend of mine, Dr. John Kelly, who runs the Recovery Research Institute at Harvard, did a very interesting study. And he gave trained clinicians, so we're not talking people on the street, we're talking trained clinicians, identical scenarios about describing people. And in one, he referred to the person as a substance abuser. And in the other one, he referred to someone as a person with a substance use disorder. And even among trained clinicians, when you refer to someone as a substance abuser, it was more likely to elicit a punitive response, right? So think of the language that we no longer use for people with other disabilities and diseases, but we still use it for people with addiction, right? Still use words. And again, you know, I've been in recovery for a long time, and I've used this language myself. Sometimes I have let my 12-step speak seep out into my public, and it's not helpful. So when we refer to people as a substance abuser, as an addict, as a junkie, you hear that replicated. I can just hear that governor from Maine using that same language. And why it is important? Well, it's important because those of us who've been affected by this, we hear that language. And it's no secret that that kind of moral and judgmental language keeps people from getting care and delays help-seeking behavior. But it also influences public policy. And that's the important piece, right? So not only the signal that we send, but it influences public policy. So when Governor LePage thinks of people as addicts and junkies, it gets translated into his action or his inaction and his crazy statements, right? And it gets replicated in what legislators think, what parents think, and what folks at the community level think, right? So all of you know and have experienced firsthand, not in my backyard. And it's fundamentally how we view people with addictive disorders in the United States, and whether or not they're deserving of care. So right now, our office is in the middle of getting comments. Our intention is to put out guidance to our federal agencies about the use of appropriate, non-stigmatizing, non-judgmental language in our federal communications, in our federal grants. I hope that that influences your work. I know we've talked about this, and people have written about even the further stigmatizing language associated with medication-assisted treatment. If I ever hear the words dirty and clean again, I will kick you out of this fellowship. So, I want to end by those of us who are leaving federal service. We get a little verklempt in terms of the work that we're doing. But I really want to thank Mark for inviting you here. I can think of no better group of people who have long suffered from a lack of appreciation, a lack of understanding, and stigma, quite honestly, in what you do on a daily basis. But I hope that you know that your partnership and your work matters to us, both personally and professionally. And there is no better consolation. And, you know, I've been around a long time, and hearing someone's story of recovery, hearing the transformative power of what you do on a daily basis, I think there is no better work to be had anywhere than the work that you're doing on a daily basis. And I hope you feel appreciated and supported by the work that we do and our federal partners. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, as we wrap up, and if you want to win your raffle prizes, you may want to stay in the room. You may want to stay in the room. There are some really good prizes, and the winner of the silent auction for the Marriott. But aside from this, Michael, thank you. Thank you for being in our corner. And wherever you go, you should know that we will be in yours. That is true. So now, at this point, I'm going to ask Vicki Walters and Allegra Shore to come up to this podium. We are going to transition, but before we do this, I really want to thank our staff who have put this conference together, Carlene Maxwell Taylor, Angelina Budia, Tiana Manderson. They've been wonderful. They work with Alex Springer at Tally Management and all of her associates who've been at the registration booth, our volunteers. But Vicki, you've done a great job in chairing this conference with all of your committee chairs. I am grateful. So now what we're going to do is have our raffle. Someone is going to win some great prizes, and Allegra will announce that. But before we do that, Vicki, one last time.
All right, thank you all very much. Thank you for coming to the conference. I hope you had a great time in Baltimore, and I hope you had a great time at the conference. Please fill out your evaluations. They're really important. They help us for next year, 2018, in New York, New York. And because I don't want to stand in front of you and getting out of here today, and I don't want to stand in front of you in the raffle prizes, which are going to be fantastic. I promise you're going to love them. I'd like to hand over the ceremonial baton, which we really don't have a baton, but I'm going to pretend we do, to Allegra Shore from New York City. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Vicki and her wonderful committee, and to Mark and ATOD and everybody here for a fantastic conference. So without further ado, everybody wants to get underway, but we have the first prize, which is our silent auction, which is New Year's Eve at the Marriott Marquis in Times Square, watching the ball drop, to Mr. Charles Mondre. Okay, our first, actually it would be our fourth prize, but actually the most valuable prize, which is the conference registration for ATOD in New York City 2018. And we're going to pick that out of the bag here. And this goes to Alexis Palmieri. All right. Congratulations. All right. Okay. The third prize, the $200 Amazon gift card, goes to Jennifer Palo. Congratulations. Second prize, the Apple Watch, thank you, goes to Candace Marshall. Hey. Hey. Congratulations. And finally, the grand prize, the $500 Amex card, goes to Paulette Lungu from the Jesu ACT in Philadelphia. Paulette? Paulette. Paulette?
See, if you're not here, you can't claim the prize.
There you go. See what happens? Oh. All right. Next. Chanel Green from Turning Point. Yay! Congratulations. And it is my great, great honor to say hooray. And we will see you all March 2018 in New York City. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.